at 12. And I also heard he was going to go up 20th Street, and I don't know the topography of downtown that well, but I remember thinking, I hope it doesn't come by. Well, sure enough, about right in the middle of my efforts to preach, here comes this incredible noise outside, and it was the St. Patrick's Day Parade. And it reminded me of a story that my old uncle used to say, and I would have used it today. It was perfect, but Dean Saul is just an absolute tyrant on time. The last thing he says to you when you're going is 17 minutes, 17 minutes. Don't forget that. And, you know, when you have an old Baptist like me, that really is what Peter, what his name would call a challenge, a challenge. But anyway, I didn't have time to tell it, but it crossed my mind as all of this noise of this parade was going by. Some of you may be old enough to remember the old Pat and Mike jokes, that they were quintessential Irishmen who came over to this country after the potato famine in the 19th century. And I remember my uncle used to love to tell about it. Pat and Mike had just gotten to Boston. They were just overawed by the city. And back in those days, the fire engines, this is back in the 1850s, were a horse-drawn carriage, and what they would do would put a big steam vat and they'd build a fire under it. And that's where they'd get the pressure to shoot water up into the taller buildings. And so whenever you would see one, they'd do this huge fire underneath this great pot. Well, of course, Pat and Mike had never seen anything like that. And in the middle of the night, they're there in a cheap hotel, and all of a sudden the fire alarm goes off, and here come all these fire trucks by. And Pat wakes up and looks out the window and sees all this, and he goes and wakes up Mike and says, "Get up quick, Mike, get up quick. They're moving hell, and 3 loads have already gone by." And I remember thinking, well, they're moving hell out there today, and at least 3 loads have gone by. But my favorite Irish story, and I've told you all this before, but in '90 we were in Dublin, Ireland. We went to a wonderful pub one night where this just absolutely hilarious stand-up comedian, Irish comedian, and he was, among other things, spoofing his fellow Irish citizens for being so literal-minded and so kind of dense. And he told about an Irishman who went to London for the first time and just found the city absolutely dazzling, went to the theater, went out to dinner, and he's taking a subway back to his hotel about 3 a.m. And he gets off and he gets to the escalator, and there's this big sign that says, "Dogs must be carried on the escalator." And he says, "Faith and Begorry, where am I going to find a dog this time of night?" Now that is literalism run amok, is it not? Feel like you got to do it if the sign says it. But welcome and blessed St. Patrick's Day, and may we all be grateful for the wonderful heritages that lie behind us. One quick announcement: a month from today is going to be the big gala time of celebration for St. Luke's. It will mark our 50th anniversary. That was actually the Sunday where they had their first services down here in the little, what is now Emmett O'Neill Library site. It was an old farmhouse then. And so the weekend of the 17th and 18th of April, we're really planning special events. You should be getting an invitation in the mail right away if you're a member. Also, the dialogue next week here, and it's a month away, but since AEA is coming up, I hope you'll mark the April the 17th and 18th as a time for us to really look back with gratitude and look ahead in hope, because we do have a wonderful, wonderful heritage here at St. Luke's, and I really hope that we can together give great gratitude to God and also give thanks for our wonderful forebears. One of the things we're going to do that Sunday, the 18th, is reenact. We're going to have a reenactment parade, and we're going to go from here down to Emmett O'Neill and have some prayers. I've asked Lee Graham, who was the rector at that point, to have just a few reflections. Then we're going to move over to the Steeple Arts Building, second site of our church, and again some reflections and prayers. And then we're going to come back. And we've been looking for a 1949 car, because that's the year the church was started. And would you believe someone has come up with a 1949 Chrysler convertible. It's one of these old town and country wooden bodies, wonderful one. And so we've asked Billy Hood, who was the senior warden and so instrumental in the early day, we're going to let him be the grand marshal of the parade. We're going to let him ride in the convertible, and we'll process down with our cross in front of us and reenact the different places where God has chosen to bring this church into existence. Again, my welcome to you tonight. I want to thank all the people that have helped to serve. We have one more in this series before Holy Week, and Gail Sharp said to me tonight that she's had such wonderful cooperation from many of you who helped to serve, and we do thank you for doing that. Let's ask God's blessings on the next few moments of our lives, and let's offer ourselves to His presence. Let us pray. Holy God, we thank you this night for the great grace of life, for getting to be alive and for having the health to be here. May the sense of community in this room give us hope that we're not alone in our spiritual journey. And I pray this night that you would fill my mind and my mouth with words of truth, and that you would be the source of taking this truth and planting it deep in our hearts. We need to know that you're with us and for us always, no matter what. May our trust be deepened this night and our hope enlarged. Through Christ we pray. Amen. My theme, as you well know, is how can we hope in a world like this? This is the fourth of five talks that I've given, and I said the very first night that I had a double motivation for particularly presenting to focusing on this reality. I myself want to become a more hopeful person because I feel like that hope is absolutely essential given our human makeup. Having some lively sense of the future, having some sense of prospect is to our spirits what air is to our bodies, what food and drink is to our physical organism. If you will think about the times that you have lost touch with hope, and remember what it feels like to wake up in the morning and not have anything to look forward to look out there at the great unknown future and not have anything out there that beckons you, anything that arouses a sense of delight and desire. That is a living death. It has been described with many different metaphors. It feels like entrapment. It feels like checkmate. It feels like that you've suddenly been thrust into a kind of oceanic kind of futility, kind of endlessness. I think we would all agree that what food is to the body, hope is to the spirit. So I myself long to deepen my connection with hope, and I long to offer you ways authentically to hope. And so that's what I would like to do tonight. I have last week focused on the aspect of hope that had to do with the future. In fact, when we think of hope, I think we tend to think of the great not yet, because hope does have to do with possibilities. But tonight I want to talk about a facet of hope that applies to another sector of our existence, namely how we process our memories, how we live with the past that has already taken place. Because one of the great enemies of hope is we've had so many bad experiences back there that we have really been robbed of any kind of sense that there can be possibilities and can be a future. Now, my friend Sam Keene was working his way through his graduate work at Princeton University, doing a doctorate in philosophy. He was in a very cerebral, very bookish period of his life, and he was helping earn his way through by being the youth minister in a Presbyterian church. He was himself an ordained minister. And one night he told me that one of his students asked him to give a definition of a human being, and in his bookish way he says, we are polytemporal beings. And that's really a pretty abstract concept, I admit. I remember years ago when I was in the Baptist church, we were ordaining a young man who was getting ready to go off to the seminary, and he had been serving in a little county seat town church in Mississippi. And so when they were giving him his words of blessing to go off, a dear old farmer said, Brother Charlie, if they give a course in big words at the seminary, you don't need to take it. You've already got enough of those big words already. You don't need to learn any more. Polytemporal really means that we humans are connected to three different sectors of time. It means that we have three unique capacities. We have the gift of awareness, which connects us to the present. We have the gift of memory, which means that we still have access to things that have already happened. And we also have some powers of anticipation to look ahead and to be able to expect, to a limited degree, to predict what is going to happen. Now, the great trick of maturity is to keep all three of these in their proper role and not let them contaminate each other, because none of these are absolute. We are never totally aware. Our memory is at best fragmentary, and our senses of being able to predict the future also have great limits. So none of these are absolute. All three of them go together to make up our humanhood. But here again, memory, which is what I want to talk about tonight, the way you remember the past, it is at once an incredibly wonderful gift. You realize, do you not, that what we're doing right now would not be possible if none of you had the capacity of memory. It is your being able to remember what words mean that make this interchange that we're having right now possible. If you've ever been around somebody who's had shock treatment, if you've ever had contact with a person who's in some phase of amnesia, you know what a tragedy it is to have lost touch with the past, because this is the context, this is the depth, this is where the meaning of our lives come from. And therefore memory is an incredibly wonderful gift, but it can take over completely. It can also become something that crushes instead of something that enables us to live fully in awareness and also have a sense of hope as far as the future is concerned. So I had a good friend who said one time, "Tell me how you remember, and I'll tell you who you are." Because the way we exercise this particular gift, I think it's going to have a tremendous impact on our capacity to live hopefully, and therefore to have a sense that what lies out ahead does have the possibility of meaning. The corruption of memory was brought home to me very dramatically back in the 1980s when a good friend of me sent a little book entitled Prisoners of Childhood by Alice Miller. She is a Swiss psychotherapist. She's quite well known. And she wrote this little book out of her extensive practice. And her thesis is that all of us come out of childhood with two specific kinds of wounds. She says the first is the wound of grievance. This is because none of us were born to angels. None of us came into this world through people that had it absolutely together. Even though our parents may have been at their dead level best mature, many of them had needs of their own which were so overwhelming that they were not there for us when we needed them. Or they had needs of theirs which they met at our expense, or some combination of the two. And so every one of us, no matter how good your parenting was, every one of us have a legitimate catalog of grievance. Wounds were inflicted on us at our tenderest and most vulnerable time that leave all kinds of scars. But she says we have not done our lives any more perfectly than did our parents. And so in addition to the woundedness of grievance, there is also that legacy of guilt, where we, looking back, when we get to adulthood, can remember those times we've done things we wish we hadn't done, or those times we left undone things that it would have been so helpful if they had been done. None of us have done it perfectly. All of us have skeletons in the closet. There are moments, I think, in every honest person's life when you wake up in the dead of the night and you remember, and if the lights were on, it would be clear that you were blushing, or maybe even weeping, because you would to God you could go back and do differently something that lies back there in the past. Now, Dr. Miller's thesis is that unless we do the work of mourning, that's her metaphor. I think she's talking about therapy. I think she's talking about serious self-examination. I think she's talking about all kinds of spiritual disciplines and formation. Unless, she says, we do some honest work with grievance and guilt, the wounds that others have inflicted on us and the resentment that this creates, or the guilt that we have bear because of the wounds we've inflicted on others and on ourselves, that unless we do some serious work, we're going to remain prisoners of childhood when we get to our adulthood. And I think this is a very valid point, which is to say that we need to have something mixed in with our own memory. We need to have something other than the way we've done it in order for the past not to become something crushing and therefore cut us off from hope in the present and in the future. Now, if we don't do that work of mourning or do that work of self-examination, then our sense of grievance becomes a kind of dungeon where we find ourselves entrapped. If you let grievance become absolutely escalated in your way of remembering, it can turn you into a very untrusting person. It can make you feel that this is a world in which there's nobody that you can really depend on. It can also make you just a walking time bomb of resentment. And one of the things it can do is to transform you into a blame-oriented person so that you don't take any responsibility for your own actions and you put all of the responsibility for the bad things in life on somebody else. So Scott Peck calls that a character disorder. The person who has no sense of conscience about his or her own behavior, everything is somebody else's fault. I've told you about the fight that broke out on an elementary playground at school one day, and the teacher finally got it sorted out, and she said, "Okay, I want to know, how did it start?" And this cocky little boy said, "It all started when he hit me back." No, not what I did. It was all his fault. Or I saw this cartoon once where a child has brought home a report card and the father has this terrible frown on his face, and you can tell that it's all F's on the report card. And here sits this cocky little boy and say, "Well, what should we blame it on? Heredity or environment? You know, couldn't be anything that I have done, God forbid." A blame-oriented way of doing life is a corruption of the gift of memory. And I remember so well when, back in the 60s, when we had such generational hostility, that it looked like that everybody was resorting to finding somebody else to scapegoat for the problem. So the dungeon of grievance would be a terrible way to have to live out your whole life. Untrusting, angry, resentful, always blaming somebody else. But the other extreme is that if we let our guilt grow to a tremendous extent so that it blocks out everything else, then instead of becoming untrusting and resentful people, an even more tragic thing can happen. And that is, our sense of failure about the past will settle into something that is utterly malignant of spirit, which is what today is called shame. I think one of the great advances we've made in human understanding in this century is to distinguish between guilt and shame. Guilt, I see, as having bad feelings about certain things that you have done. Shame is coming to have bad feelings about what you are. It is when guilt is allowed to settle in the very depths of your being, and it becomes a kind of self-definition. You cease to think of yourself as having many parts, some of which you have not done well, and you begin to say, "I am something bad," and that is a terribly immobilized state. John Bradshaw speaks of shame as the hole in the soul. He says it's one of the deepest problems to try to undo and to get back into some kind of creating functioning. I remember telling you the second night, or maybe the first night, about the familiar story of Frederick Buechner's father, born into an achieving family in New York City, went to Princeton, quite successful, had every sense of promise. But the Great Depression came, and he wasn't able to get and keep jobs that paid him enough to take care of his family the way that their affluence had made them accustomed. And he got into alcohol as a way of covering his sense of failure. And finally, one Saturday morning, and this is an event that has forever shaped Frederick Buechner's life, he got up for everybody else, looked in on his two little sleeping sons, went down in the garage, pulled down the door, turned on the ignition key, sat down on the running board of the old Chevrolet, and was asphyxiated before anybody in the family could find him. And you may remember I said that for years, when Buechner was asked, "How did your father die?" he said he died of heart trouble. And that was at least partially true because he had a heart, and it was troubled. And the interesting thing is, a month after the suicide, when nobody knew quite what on earth had happened, his mother, Buechner's mother, this man's wife, picked up a copy of Gone with the Wind, which had just come out that very year. And Mr. Buechner was a voracious reader. And on the last page of that novel by Margaret Mitchell, she found a pencil note that said, "Dear," and I forget her name. He said, "I love you with all my heart, but I'm no damn good. Please forgive me. Give my watch to Jamie. Give my stick pen to Frederick. I love you with all my heart," and signed his name. Now notice what he said. Not, "I have done bad things," in the sense that I couldn't get and hold jobs. His guilt had descended into shame. I am no damn good. Now that is when guilt is allowed to become absolute, when our sense of the imperfectness of the past becomes self-definition, and that is totally immobilizing. I don't know whether you remember, but there's a story over in the Gospels where Jesus is teaching one day in a crowded house, and suddenly he hears all this commotion over his head, and the roof begins to open up, sunlight begins to come in, and then his astonishment, he sees 4 caring people lower down before him into this crowded house a man on a pallet. They had brought this man to Jesus, couldn't get to him through the door, so they ingeniously found this way of getting him right in front of Jesus. Well, the man was totally paralyzed, could not move one muscle of his body. And in that story, Jesus, spiritually perceptive as he was, says to the man, "Your sins are forgiven. Rise, take up your bed and walk," because Jesus must have sensed that what had brought this man to be physically immobile was a sense of guilt that had grown into shame, and only the gift of forgiveness could break the spell. Now, I do think there is something bigger than what we have done or failed to do on history. And if there is a solution to this terribly immobilizing experience of shame, it is exactly what Jesus did for that man, which was somehow to make real and decisive an experience of the one thing that I know that can keep the past from being a prison, keep it from being a dungeon of grievance or a dungeon of guilt that turns into shame. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight, because in addition to what I talked about last week, that it is in the heart of God to give us help. I talked last week about God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in time of trouble. The one who promises, "I will supply all of your needs according to my riches and glory." Those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength, mount up with wings like eagles, run and not be weary, walk and not faint. All of that last week was the promise that divine energies can be counted on to meet us in the midst of life and to help us with whatever it is that we face. But tonight there is another facet of the divine mystery that I think has the potential to liberate us from those things in the past that could destroy our hope. And in addition to God's incredible love, in addition to His ingenious strength, in addition to His extraordinary wisdom, there is this quality of everlasting and patient mercy. If there is a hope for us with our imperfect past, if there is a hope of the way we process our memories, it's going to be when we sense that among all the other things that are in this mystery who lies behind it all, there is a forgiving dimension. There is a patient, merciful side to the holy. And therefore the hope that we can have that all of our mistakes in the past are not ultimate and crushing, the hope lies in the fact that in the heart of the eternal, in addition to being generous, in addition to being ingenious, in addition to having all kinds of wisdom, there is in the heart of the eternal a willingness to forgive and to patiently work with us through all of our incredible imperfections. I have suggested here that God's quality of everlasting mercy, that wonderful phrase in the Psalms, His mercy endures forever. That is going to be the quality in the holy that I want to suggest is going to make possible our having hope for the future by what it is able to do with the past. Now, what does it mean for God to have that quality, that property, as we say? Many of you who are familiar with the Right One service know that the prayer of humble access is, we do not presume to come to this thy table, trusting in our own righteousness, We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table, but thou art the same Lord, whose property is always to have mercy. Now, if God were not like that, if God were a absolute demanding perfectionist, if God said, okay, I'm going to give you one chance, and if you blow it, then that's it, you're out of here forever. If that were the nature of the divine, friends, we would not be here tonight. If there was not this quality of mercy, creation as we know it simply would not have survived. It was God's willingness to be a nurturer and not a demanding perfectionist. That is the reason that creation has continued. I love that passage in Jeremiah where the prophet is told to go down to the potter's house and to watch what was happening there. If you've ever been around somebody who is skilled at the shaping of pots, you know that they start out with a lump that has hardly any shape to it whatsoever. And they put it on a wheel and it begins to spin. And patiently and skillfully they start to bring some kind of form to that block of clay. And oftentimes they will stop and pick out imperfections in the substance. Sometimes the potter will step back and look at what he or she is doing from an angle. And slowly and patiently, over a matter of hours and sometimes days and months, what was absolutely formless becomes something absolutely exquisite. But it comes through a slow and patient process. And God is more to be understood as a potter and a nurturer than God is an absolutely demanding perfectionist who says, okay, I'm going to give you one chance, and if you blow it, it's all over. If God did not have that quality, then our past really would crush us absolutely into a sense of despair. I mentioned the other night that the great story that comes to us through the Scripture is what we know that gives us the basis of hope. In the earliest creation story, second chapter of the book of Genesis, there is this wonderful, wonderful picture of God wanting to share God's life with creatures so they could know God's joy. And so God, in a very primitive kind of image, is pictures coming down and stooping over and forming a human being out of the dust of the earth, and then stooping over and breathing his very life into that creature. And the whole goal of this experiment was that God would share God's kind of joy with creatures of his own making. Well, for a while, that old account says that God and these humans that he'd formed out of the dirt, they walked together and enjoyed each other in the cool of the day. It's a beautiful picture of what God had intended in the making of this whole world. But one night in this ancient story, God comes down and he can't find the creatures that he's created. And so the first two questions of Genesis are, where are you and what have you done? Well, the answer was they were hiding. And what they had done was to take the gift of joy that God had bequeathed to them, and they took it out of God's hands and began to treat it as if it was a possession, as if it was theirs by right to do with whatever they wanted to do. And in effect, by taking their own wisdom and substituting that for the wisdom of God, by ignoring the design of the creation and arrogantly deciding they knew better than God how to make creation work, they, in effect, as I said that night, began to unmake creation, to reduce it back into the chaos and nothingness from which God had rescued it. It'd be exactly like you're deciding one afternoon that whoever designed the motor of your car really didn't know what they were doing, and that you knew better. So on a nice afternoon like today, you'd get your blanket and spread it out in the backyard. You'd get your wrenches and your equipment, and you would dismantle the motor, take all the parts out, lay them all out on the ground, and then you'd start putting them back under the hood the way you wanted to, the way you thought they ought to be. Well, I'll tell you exactly what would result from that. That car would never hit a lick again. That mechanism would have been unmade, and it would have been destroyed. And that's what God in this primitive story discovered, that by taking creation out of God's hands and doing with it things God never intended to be done, that they had brought incredible destruction and pain into their lives. Now this action, because of God's tender nature, broke his heart. It made him so sad that creatures that he had one goal for had chosen another path. But the incredible part of the story is that though it broke God's heart, it did not break his desire to bless. It did not extinguish his desire to have creatures who could know his joy, and it didn't cause him to give up on the whole of creation. Because in the quaintness of that story, although God said terrible, terrible pain's going to come on you because of what you've done, I'm not going to give up on you. And so the story ends, it is so poignant, with God himself, those same hands that have formed humans out of the dust. God makes aprons for these creatures who now, because of their guilt, saw themselves as naked and were therefore ashamed of themselves and in hiding. God makes aprons, as if to say, though you have broken my heart, I am not giving up on you. Let's begin to stoop over and pick up the pieces and see what we can do with what you have done to creation. I repeat, if it were not for that incredible hope in God that something could still be done even in the face of sin, we would not be here. I remember years ago, again, in the Vietnam War, when the tensions between the generations was so bad. I remember hearing a country music song one afternoon. It turned out it was a letter that a father was writing to his son in college. And in the letter, the Battle Hymn of the Republic is playing in the background. It's very patriotic. In the letter, he reiterates that he fought in World War II, that he had fought to keep the freedoms of his country alive, that he loved the flag and he loved America. And he said, I know you're having lots and lots of pressures in college to turn against this wonderful country of ours, to do things that are unspeakable. But then it came to the climax when it said, I want you to know this, son. If you burn your draft card, I want you to go ahead and burn your birth certificate also, because as of that moment, you're no longer a son of mine. Complete disownment in the face of a certain kind of action. If God had responded to the first sin of the human species with that kind of demanding perfectionism, if God had said, okay, burn your birth certificate because you have done something that is displeasing to me, my friends, we would not be here. The great good news is that there is more mercy in God than there is sin in us. There is more of the desire to see what can still be done than all the mistakes that we have made. And if you can ever get that proportion of reality clear, that God's goodness is bigger than our badness, and that God's willingness, patient mercy, to keep on doing with us that we might somehow be made like the potter makes the clay into something beautiful, that God continues to hold that hope. You see, our hope, in spite of our past, lies in God's hope that there is still a future for us, in spite of all that we've done. Now, what this means is that this aspect of God that I think is so absolutely crucial, alongside His generosity, alongside His power, alongside His wisdom, that this willingness to be merciful with us, this is precisely what needs to be mixed into our remembering if we're not going to be crushed by the past. Now, what is forgiveness? As I've said to you so many times in here and up in the great nave of our church, forgiveness is a gift, as surely as our birth was a gift. We no more deserve to be forgiven than we deserve to be born. This comes to us out of a generosity that comes up out of the bountiful nature of God. Forgiveness, as I've said so often, is being given second chances at life on the same terms you were given your first chance at birth. If you just ask, what did I do to work my way in here? The answer is nothing at all. What do I do to deserve forgiveness? Nothing, nothing at all. It is a sheer and total gift. And therefore, a proper response, when it dawns on us how incredibly, incredibly good God is, the proper response is not to embrace any kind of pride, but it is to fall in a kind of adoring humility. An astonishment that there could be that kind of goodness when we have done this to God, that God is still willing to be that way to us. When gratitude and marvel takes the place of pride and conceit, and we're humble enough to receive something that we know we did not deserve, then that is when forgiveness becomes a dynamic, dynamic process in our lives. That's when forgiveness becomes the gift that it is meant to do. And you need to realize that mercy is a deeper expression of love and generosity. It was one thing for God to want to give God's very life into our lives. It was wonderful for God to give us that chance to live. But mercy is a deeper expression, because mercy is willingness to continue to have hope, even in the face of that which is utterly destructive. But if you can ever get clear that God's goodness is bigger than your badness, that the power of God to forgive is finally greater than any of our power to sin, then it does change the way you process your memories, and it opens up a whole new way for the past to continue to live and enrich the present and the future, instead of crushing it into despair. My favorite story about the true dynamics, the true wonder of forgiveness, is one I've told you before. It's about Arthur Gordon, born over here in Savannah, Georgia. Went to public schools there, and when he finished, did something that very few people in Savannah had ever done before him. And that was, he was given a scholarship to Yale University, and he had the courage to pit his Southern public school education against the academic rigors of the Ivy League. He went in the early 1930s, and not only was up to the challenge, but he more than succeeded. In fact, when he graduated in the middle 30s, he was one of 32 American males that was paid the high honor of being given a Rhodes Scholarship. It meant he got to go to Oxford to study there in that wonderful, wonderful ancient university. And since English literature was his chosen academic discipline, it was a double benefit. And 2 absolutely marvelous years. Even got to spend an afternoon with Rudyard Kipling right before the great triumphalist died. He came back to this country just as the clouds of World War II were beginning to break. And like most of his generation, he felt called on to go into the military, spent 5 years in the Air Force. And when he was mustered out, he got together with some of his old Yale friends, and they decided to flesh out a dream that had actually been born in the pubs of New Haven when they were sitting around like whiffing poofs and wondering what they might do with their lives. They kept saying, if we could form an avant-garde literary journal to give young fledgling writers a chance to become recognized, that would be something that is not happening today. Most of the old journals are very stodgy, they're very, very exclusive. So they decided to do something about it with all of the exuberance that came out of post-war II life. And it turned out that young Gordon wound up being the editor of this journal, and it turned out to be wonderfully, wonderfully successful. He got some of his own stuff printed. He got some of his friends brought into recognition for the first time. It was a very, very heady experience. But it turned out he was a better poet than he was a business person. He made some very foolish financial decisions. He put his own name on several loans that he had taken out. And after 2 years, though critically acclaimed, that the journal crashed, and he was out of a job and also several $1,000s personally in debt. Well, to make matters worse, his high school sweetheart back in Savannah, who he had written interminable letters, finally gave up hope that he was ever going to come back and they were going to get married as they had planned. He had gone first to New Haven and then to Oxford and then to the war, and now he's back in Manhattan. And she just finally lost hope, and so she broke off their engagement and in a matter of weeks married somebody else, which was a crushing blow to his ego, which meant that in a matter of days, this bright young achiever saw his whole world come crashing down around his head. He had never experienced significant failure before. He had never been publicly humiliated. He had always lived to the sound of applause, and suddenly he was finding himself with everybody saying that he had not done life as well as it appeared. Well, it turned out that his experience of failure was more than he could process. He became very depressed. He even got suicidal. He wouldn't even get up in the morning and shave. Kept the shades down all day. A typical example of what happens when you lose touch with hope. Well, his family down in Savannah got very concerned, came rushing up to New York City, found him in this disheveled, immobilized condition. And they were instrumental in getting him to an old therapist who happened to be a friend of the family who practiced on Manhattan Island. And he writes that one October afternoon, as those fall cold rains were beginning to come down, he found a taxi, found the address. He said the way the weather was outside was reflective of the way he was feeling inside. But he went into the old therapist's office, and where the true therapist does his or her work, what was created was a place where it was safe to unpack his heart, a place where there was no harsh judgment, a place where he was not being condemned, and it was free for him to dig down and to really get in touch with those things that he had done that he would to God he hadn't done, and the things that he'd left undone that he would to God he had. It was like taking undigested food and finally getting it up and getting it out. And when he had finished, the old therapist very wisely said, "You know, your story is not all that different than lots of other stories that I've heard in this place." He said, "Would you be willing to listen to a brief excerpts of some other folk who've been where you're here? I have their permission to use this material. Would you be willing to listen? It might give you a sense of perspective." And so he agreed, and so the old man put on a tape, and it was a man's voice. As he began to talk, it's clear that as a father, years before, he'd done some very, very unwise things with his little boy. And now the son was suffering terribly emotional wounds, and the father was filled with self-loathing for the way he had mishandled his parental powers. The next tape was a woman's voice. You could tell she was just getting in touch with the fact that she'd had a big hand in the demise of her marriage. Up to then, she'd been blaming this other person for all the problems. Now it was coming clear that their marriage was truly mutual, and she had helped bring about its demise, and she too was filled with self-recrimination. The third tape was a highly placed business executive. He confessed he had not researched the project carefully and gotten into something that the company wound up losing millions of dollars doing. His own job was in jeopardy. He was so down on himself for the way he had not done what he should have done. And when the third tape ended, the old therapist said, "Do you sense a common thread in these stories?" And the bright young Rhodes Scholar said, "Well, of course." That each of these people are saying, in effect, if only I had done differently, then the present and the future would be different. He said, "You're exactly right." He said, "Now I want to tell you that I've got each of these unstuck from where you hear them in these tapes. I was able to get all three of these people back to creative coping with life. And in every case, the crucial thing, the tilt point, was my getting them to substitute two different words for the words you hear most often on the tape." He said, "I taught them to say next time rather than if only." He said, "Think about it. If only points to that sector of life that cannot be altered no matter how intensely you feel about it. We humans can't go back and undo and redo the things we've done in the past. There is a frozenness to the alreadiness of the past that cannot be altered. And therefore," he said, "energies spent lamenting the past are energies that are largely wasted." But he said, "Next time" points to that sector of life that is still fluid, it's still out there to be shaped and formed. And he said, "If you can take what you have learned from the past, even the most painful experiences, and put those at the service of next time. If you can say, I have learned something so that the next time I find myself in a given situation, I'll remember, I won't let the past be wasted." Then he said, even the worst things can become a catalyst for the best. He said, "I will accept you as a patient, but going in, I want you to know that our agenda is going to be to reprocess the way you remember the past. I want to teach you to say next time, which is a sacrament of hope, rather than if only, which is a futile kind of lamenting." It was the first thing that had made any sense to Gordon in months. And so he agreed to start the therapy. And for the next 6 months, twice a week, with all kinds of subtle skill, the old gentleman was able to get from the top of his head down to the bottom of his feelings that seminal shift in how he remembered. And after 6 months, when the therapy had come to a termination, and he lived on, years later, Arthur Gordon said that one thing that he had learned from the old therapist had been of more practical help to him than all he'd learned at Oxford and in New Haven put together. Now, friends, I think this is the essence of the miracle of forgiveness. When we, by the grace of God, are given the power to substitute the words next time for the words if only. Because it is in shifting from a lament about how badly we have done it to a realization that there's something bigger than we are in history There's something bigger is still giving us breath, and so that God must still have hope for us. And if we can start saying next time, when we remember the pains of the past, and if we can resolve not to let the pain of the past be wasted, but educate us to help us, then even the worst of times can become the catalyst for the best of things. And I can't think of a better way of describing the incredible gift of forgiveness than saying it gives you the power to shift from if only lamenting to next time kind of anticipation, and to realize that underneath it all, God is more interested in your future than in your past, more interested in what you can yet become than what you used to be. You are the clay on the wheel of the potter, and those hands that are working with you are patient, they are merciful, they are full of hope for what you can yet become. If you're still breathing, it means that God still wants you to be, and He still has a future for you. And that's where the power of hope enables us to let the past be what it is, namely a place to learn, a place to give us a depth of wisdom. It is not meant by God to crush us. It is meant by God to be an agent of blessing. I have every confidence in the world that God is more interested in what we have learned from our mistakes than that we have made mistakes. But as I've said before, what is so difficult for us in accepting that is that we have to let go our pride. We have to stop getting our sense of worth by how well we have done life. And we have got to let go our pride and receive this incredible undeserved gift of grace, which cuts right across the egocentricity of our fallen hearts. But when we can get to the place that we remember some terrible, terrible thing that we've done, and instead of saying how stupid, continue to give me breath and to give me a future, even though He knows all about that. If we can shift our sense of proportion between the bigness of grace and the relative smallness of our sin, if we can say, like John the Baptist said to Jesus, He must increase and I must decrease, there is an act of denying ourselves when it comes to receiving the gift of forgiveness, because it is admitting that what we have done and failed to do, significant as those are, I'm not trying to discount that at all, significant as those things are, they are not as significant as what God in His incredible grace is willing and still able to do. St. Paul said, where sin abounds, grace abounds even more. There is more over here in the divine heart of mercy than there is over here in our broken and sinful hearts. And if we can shift our sense of trust from what we are and what we have done to what God is and what God can do, then I think incredible hope can begin to flow into the present and make its way into the future. I'd like to sum up everything that I believe tonight about forgiveness in a story that I've told many times, but for me it's archetypal. It was told me by a friend of mine who had a little boy, 5 years old. He went to kindergarten in September for the first time. And in October, the teacher of the kindergarten class said to these little children, would you like to make something for your parents with your hands as a Christmas present? Most they'll get on Christmas are store-bought presents. They'd love to have something that has the fingerprints of your creativity on it. Well, that really struck fire in my friend's little boy. And at that point, my friend was smoking a pipe, and so the little boy said, I'd love to make my papa an ashtray. She said, okay. So the teacher got him some clay and wonderfully helped him best she could to form it into roughly the shape of an ashtray. She said, what's your papa's favorite color? And he said blue, so they dyed the clay blue. She even got a little kiln. And as he put the creation of his hands into it, he watched with wonder as the heat came on. And it got bright and it got hard. Every step of this process just heightened the child's excitement. He could just see Christmas morning His father opens a tie, he opens some handkerchiefs, and he opens some socks, and then suddenly, here's a present, and it's clear this was made by his son's own loving hands. Well, the last day before Christmas holidays came, they had the traditional pageant, which all of us parents and grandparents have lived through with different degrees of endurance. And after everybody had finished, the little boy went to his classroom and he got that carefully prepared and beautifully wrapped package. But in his excitement to put on his coat, wave goodbye to his friends, and run down the hall, he inadvertently tripped. And out of his hands came that package, and down it came on the floor with this terrible, terrible sound of breaking. But when the lad realized that all the work of the fall and all his hopes for Christmas morning were completely dashed, not surprisingly, he began to weep as if his heart would break. It seemed as if this was the end of the world, an absolute and total ultimate tragedy. My friend had a background in the military, and he told me later that it made him uncomfortable to be in a public place and having a male child of his crying so openly. So he walks over like some Prussian general and says, "Don't cry, son, don't cry, doesn't matter, doesn't make any difference." And he said his wife, who was so much wiser in the things of the heart than he, pushed him aside and said, "Of course it matters, of course it matters that something this important has gotten broken." And with that, she swept up that weeping child into her arms and began to weep with him. The tears that are always appropriate when the precious things of life have gotten broken. But then, after both of them had had out their cry, my friend said he watched with a kind of wordless wonder as that feminine expression of God reached in her purse and got out a handkerchief and very gently wiped the tears from the little boy's eyes and from her own eyes. And then he heard her say, "Come on, son, come on. Let's pick up the pieces, take them home, see what we can make of what is left." Now I want to say in that little family drama, the alternates in relation to the way we remember are all there. The little boy's weeping is that sense of utter fear that we have, that if we've made mistakes, we've blown it forever, and there is no future because of our past. My friend's attempt to shield himself from pain by relativizing the issues, that way will simply empty all of life of its significance and meaning. What that mother did was right at the heart of the Christian gospel, because she first of all had the courage to enter into the crucible of that child's suffering and dare to expose herself to the pain that we must always have when we do the things we shouldn't have done and leave undone the things we ought to have done. Nothing I've said tonight in any way relativizes the significance of sin. Entering the crucible of suffering that sin always creates is part of the forgiving process. But then in that other thing she did, that gathering the child up and weeping with him, and then saying the words of hope, "Come on, son. Let's pick up the pieces and take them home and see what we can make of what is left." That is the gift of next time. And friend, if you're still breathing, there's still something that can be done with the pieces of your life. I don't care how badly shattered they have become in the past. If you're still breathing, there's something that can be done. The pieces can be picked up. And only God knows how something beautiful may come out of the absolutely dreadful and the absolutely hopeless. Therefore, I beg you, let the aspect of God, God's mercy that endures forever, let that be your resource when in the dead of the night you remember the things you've done or failed to do, and you find yourself blushing. You find yourself wishing to God you could go back and undo it and redo it. You can't do that. What you can do is gather it all up, bring it to God, weep the tears that are totally appropriate, and then listen for the very voice of heaven that says, "You're still breathing, my beloved. You're still breathing. Come on. Come on." Let's gather up, pick up the pieces. Let's take them home. And together, let's see what we can make of what is left. And that, my friends, is hope. Our hope is in the name of the Lord.